Good day, everyone. My name is Nofar binti Fazlullah, and together with my pair, Claire Angshinran, we'll be presenting our research titled Examining Students' Instructional Feedback Orientation and Perceived Performance Across Lecture Feedback and AI Feedback. For this presentation, I will begin by introducing the background of the study, followed by the problem statement, significance of the study, research objectives and research questions, hypothesis, literature review, and conceptual framework. Feedback has long been recognized as an essential component in learning because it enables students to identify the mistake and strengthen their understanding. However, not every student responds to feedback in the same way. According to Yerode et al. 2022, students differ in how they value, accept, and utilize feedback, and these differences are explained by feedback orientation. Even when students receive the same feedback, their willingness to apply it depends on their individual attitudes towards receiving feedback. At the same time, the rapid development of artificial intelligence has transformed the way feedback is delivered in higher education. Recent studies by Henderson et al. 2025 further suggest that AI feedback is appreciated for its speed, accessibility, objectivity, and personalized suggestions. However, students also perceive AI feedback as less reliable and lacking the contextual understanding and professional judgment that lecturers provide. While lecture feedback remains highly credible, providing personalized feedback to every student can be demanding, and AI has the potential to complement this process. Therefore, this study compares lecture feedback and AI feedback by examining how students' feedback orientation, specifically the utility and sensitivity dimensions, relate to their perceived academic performance. Despite the growing interest in AI within education, several research gaps remain. First, previous studies have primarily compared students' perceptions of lecture feedback and AI feedback. However, there has been limited exploration of how students' attitudes towards receiving feedback influence the way they use feedback and improve their academic performance. Second, as highlighted by Lee and Moore 2024, existing research has largely focused on feedback characteristics and implementation, while broader questions regarding how feedback influences students' thought processes and learning behaviors remain underexplored. Finally, most studies investigating feedback orientation have been conducted within the workplace settings rather than higher education. Moving on, this study contributes to both educational practice and current research in several ways. Firstly, it provides lecturers with a better understanding of how undergraduate students seek, interpret, and apply feedback. This may help lecturers adapt their feedback approaches to better suit students' learning preferences and encourage more meaningful and engaging feedback. Secondly, the inclusion of AI feedback contributes to the growing field of AI in education. The findings may offer valuable insights into why students increasingly rely on AI and which aspects of AI feedback they find beneficial, which may also help lecturers to identify strategies that can be incorporated into their own feedback practices. Finally, this research raises students' awareness of their own feedback behaviors. Understanding how they receive and process feedback may encourage students to make better use of feedback, ultimately supporting improvements in their academic performance. To address these research gaps, 4 research objectives were developed. The first objective is to examine the relationship between the utility dimension of lecture feedback orientation and students' perceived performance. The second objective examines the relationship between the sensitivity dimension of lecture feedback orientation and students' perceived performance. The third objective investigates the relationship between the utility dimension of AI feedback orientation and students' perceived performance. And finally, the fourth objective examines the relationship between the sensitivity dimension of AI feedback orientation and students' perceived performance. And correspondingly, 4 research questions were formulated to investigate each of these proposed relationships. Based on the research objectives and research questions, 4 hypotheses were developed. Overall, each hypothesis proposes that the utility and sensitivity dimensions of feedback orientation have a significant relationship with students' perceived performance across both lecture feedback and AI feedback. The literature review focuses on 2 key constructs. The first construct is students' instructional feedback orientation. According to Yerode et al. 2022, students' feedback orientation influences the extent to which they utilize and benefit from different sources of feedback. Their findings indicate that students who actively engage with feedback demonstrate greater improvements in learning outcomes. Feedback orientation is measured using the Instructional Feedback Orientation Scale developed by King et al. 2009, which consists of 4 dimensions: utility, sensitivity, confidentiality, and retention. However, this study specifically focuses on the utility and sensitivity dimensions, as they are the most relevant to students' perceptions and use of lecture and AI feedback. The second construct is students' academic performance. Previous studies have consistently shown that feedback enables students to recognize areas for improvement, encouraging them to improve their work. Ahmad et al. 2021 reported lecture feedback improves students' confidence and self-efficacy, motivating them to achieve greater performance. And similarly, Lusing et al. 2026 found that AI-supported feedback assists students in refining their written work and improving the quality of their assignments. Together, these findings suggest that both lecture and AI feedback have the potential to support students' perceived academic performance, although students' feedback orientation may influence how effectively that feedback is utilized. Building upon the literature, this study is guided by feedback intervention theory. The theory suggests that the effectiveness of feedback depends on where an individual's attention is directed when receiving feedback. When learners focus on the content of the feedback itself and use it to enhance the quality of their work rather than seeing it as a critique, they are more likely to benefit from the received feedback. As illustrated in our conceptual framework, the independent variables consist of the utility and sensitivity dimensions of feedback orientation for both lecture feedback and AI feedback. These 4 variables are proposed to influence the dependent variable, which is the student's perceived performance. That concludes the first part of our presentation. I will now hand it over to Claire. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, my name is Claire Art, and I'll be starting off with the methodology. This study adopts quantitative research design using a questionnaire survey. The target population consists of undergraduate students aged between 18 and 25 years from 4 universities in Subang. A cluster sampling technique was employed, resulting in a target sample of 200 respondents. Data were collected through an online questionnaire consisting of 54 items measured using a 5-point Likert scale. The research instruments were adapted from 2 established scales. Firstly, the Student Feedback Orientation Scale by King et al., and secondly, the Student's Perception of Instructional Feedback Scale by Baidas Onlu et al. Prior to the main study, a pilot study involving 30 students was conducted to assess the reliability, clarity, and suitability of the questionnaire. The results demonstrated a strong internal consistency across all constructs, with complex alpha values ranging from 0.815 to 0.931. And since all values exceeded the recommended threshold of 0.7, the research instrument was considered reliable and suitable for domain data collection. For the main study, the data were analyzed using IBM SPSS Statistics version 30, and the Spearman's correlation was employed to examine the significance of the relationship between students' feedback orientation and their perceived performance. Now, let's move on to the findings of each of our 4 research questions. So, starting with research question 1, which looks at the relationship between the utility dimension of lecture feedback orientation and students' perceived performance. Our findings showed a moderate positive correlation with an R value of 0.391. And what this means is that students who view lecture feedback as useful are more likely to perceive that it improves their academic performance, and therefore H1A is supported. The findings suggest that when students believe feedback is valuable, they are more likely to reflect on it and apply it to their assignments, which leads to better outcomes. This also makes sense in a university setting because students generally see lecturers as credible sources of feedback, and as a result, they are more willing to implement the suggested improvements. These findings also support the feedback intervention theory, which states that feedback is most effective when it directs students' attention to the task rather than themselves. So in this case, students who perceive lecture feedback as useful focus on the content itself to help them to improve. Moving on to research question 2, which examines the relationship between the sensitivity dimension of lecture feedback orientation and students' perceived performance. The results showed a weak negative correlation with an R value of negative 0.128, which is not statistically significant, and therefore H1B is rejected. This suggests that students' emotional reactions to lecture feedback, such as feeling intimidated, embarrassed, or threatened, do not significantly affect their academic performance. Even if students experience these emotions, they are still able to use the feedback to revise their work and produce good outcomes. Interestingly, this finding does not support the feedback intervention theory, which suggests that when students focus on themselves instead of the task, emotional reactions can interfere with their performance. However, in this study, although students may feel emotionally affected by lecture feedback, these emotions do not appear to distract them from applying the feedback effectively. Next is research question 3, which investigates the relationship between the utility dimension of AI feedback orientation and students' perceived performance. The findings reveal a moderate positive correlation with an R value of 0.495, meaning that students who perceive AI feedback as useful also tend to report better performance, and therefore H2A is supported. This suggests that when students recognize AI feedback as valuable, they are more likely to engage with it, interpret the suggestions, and apply it to improve their work. The findings are also supported by research by Glusing et al., which shows that AI feedback enhances students' writing through personalized and constructive recommendations, leading to a much higher quality revisions. So relating these to feedback intervention theory, this explains why perceiving AI feedback as useful is associated with better performance, because AI feedback are often immediate, making students more likely to focus on the suggestions provided, identify gaps, and apply the recommendations to improve their work. Finally, for research question 4, which explores the relationship between the sensitivity dimensions of AI feedback orientation and students' perceived performance, the results showed a significant weak negative correlation with an R value of negative 0.261. And this small correlation suggests that student sensitivity towards AI feedback has very little meaningful influence on their perceived performance, and therefore H2B is rejected. This suggests that students who feel intimidated or uncomfortable when receiving AI feedback are still able to utilize the feedback effectively and produce quality work. Their emotional response do not seem to prevent them from benefiting from AI feedback. These findings contrast with assumptions of feedback intervention theory, which propose that emotional reactions to feedback can divert attention away from the task and reduce effectiveness. In this study, however, student sensitivity towards AI feedback does not appear to have any sort of impact on their perceived performance, suggesting that students are able to focus on applying the feedback despite any discomfort. Moving on to the conclusion, the study explored how students' feedback orientation towards both lecture and AI feedback, specifically the dimensions of utility and sensitivity, relates to their perceived performance. The findings showed that the utility dimension had a significant positive relationship with perceived performance for both lecture and AI feedback. This means that when students perceive feedback as useful, regardless of whether it comes from lectures or AI, they are more likely to report better academic performance. On the other hand, the sensitivity dimension showed no significant influence on perceived performance for both sources of feedback. This suggests that while students may experience emotional reactions when receiving feedback, these reactions do not necessarily affect them in using the feedback to improve their work. So overall, our findings suggest that students value high-quality feedback regardless of its source. Rather than viewing feedback as personal criticism, they appear to focus on using it as a tool to improve their learning and academic performance. However, this study does come with its limitations. The findings rely on self-reported measures of perceived performance, which may be subject to response bias and may not accurately reflect students' actual academic achievement. So future research could address this by looking into students' performance with their actual results to provide a more accurate understanding of feedback effectiveness. In addition to that, future studies could adopt a mixed methods approach by combining surveys with interviews, as this would provide a deeper insights into how students interpret, evaluate, and apply both lecture and AI feedback across different learning contexts. That is all from us. Thank you for listening.